Today we're speaking with Ron Day. He founded Ron Day Productions, a high-end videography business of over 25 years. Ron has shot documentaries in countries such as Peru, Guatemala, Japan, the Philippines, and India, among many others. His clients have included the Discovery Channel, Fox News, CNN, and Dateline NBC. We join Ron as he recounts lessons from shooting in crisis response situations, as well as truth and storytelling and building relationships in the video industry. Today we're here with Ron Day of Ron Day Productions, who is a high-end videographer. He's owned the company and has been in the video industry for many decades. So Ron, can you start by telling us a little bit about yourself, how you got into the industry and how you began your company?
For me, it probably started when I was about 13 years old. I was in a church out in Stowe, and missionaries would come in with these slideshows, and were fascinating stories. I mean, they were showing photos on the screen and telling stories. I looked at it and thought, boy, if you could tell that story, but with some good imagery and good storytelling, you know, if it's as moving to me as this was, but with that kind of impression of that, then that would just really, you know, have a lot of impact. So that's really how I first became interested in it. And so I went to Moody Bible Institute in Chicago and John Brown University in Arkansas, Silent Springs, Arkansas. Majored in broadcast communications, and came back and got a job. My first job was with the chapel in Akron as a media coordinator. And then I got a job at American Greetings in Cleveland as a writer-producer in the sales and marketing audiovisual department. Did that for about 4 years. And then they started laying off people, and my job was eliminated, and I ended up going to work for a production company. One of my clients that was Classic Worldwide Productions. At the time they were called Classic Video. Jerry Patton and Bob Anderson had worked for the Rex Humbard Ministry. I worked for Classic for 4 years. It was probably, I'm going to guess, 35 full-time people on staff at the time. The one thing about Jerry and Bob is they were always able to seem like they were always able to attract really good talent and people that were some of the best, and not necessarily show horses. They were workhorses. They were people who knew their craft, knew the business, and most of all, I think, a lot of character.
Thinking of your time at Classic, the years that you were there, are there any other things you can think of, or I guess stories, in terms of what you learned there that shaped you or shaped the company that you would go on to create later? Can you give us any other examples of your time at Classic there?
A big part of it I would attribute to the two owners at Classic, Jerry Patton and Bob Anderson. Two very different individuals, two very different styles of work and skill sets. Bob far more in the creative area and the idea person of, you know, thinking outside the box. And Jerry's background was more in sports truck management. He could pick up the phone, line up a truck, line up a crew, and he'd cover the Indianapolis 500 races and things like that. But it was far more the business manager and pulling together resources and getting the logistics worked out to get the people and all the equipment and all the things together where it needed to be ahead of time, on time, every time, without fail. And if it didn't exist, they'd build it. I learned that can-do attitude from Jerry and from Bob both. Again, in very different areas. Jerry with more the business part of it and being able to pull together all those resources, human resources and equipment. Bob taught me more on the producing and the directing of projects, because some of the early projects that I felt like were really, really good, Bob would look at it and say, I thought you were going to do this, you didn't do that. And I said, well, the editor didn't think we had time in the budget to do that or whatever. And he goes, you're the producer, you're the director. If you didn't do it, if it didn't get done, you failed. And it wasn't that he didn't like what I had done with it or what my editor had done with it. It was that I didn't live up to my own expectation on the project.
I'm sure being there for 4 years, you probably got to see or work on a lot of different projects. But do you recall any jobs in particular that you went through, or maybe a couple of them, when you were working at Classic, any of them that really stood out in your mind?
Yeah, I think some of the projects that were the most interesting to me were, like for instance, The Next President with David Frost, and another series called Talking with David Frost, where they would interview me, either political candidates, at the time it was like Ross Perot. David Frost would interview Bill and Hillary Clinton, George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, sit-down interviews. And it was more for PBS, so by being commercial free like that, you could spend a full hour, almost the entire time, actual face-to-face interview. It wasn't limited to, 15, 20 minutes, on the half hour, and most of it commercials, and keep cutting away.
Because it was aired on public broadcasting, you could actually sit down and have an hour-long recording and actually get content from these people so that it wasn't filled with advertisements. Comparing that type of recording to some of the things you did commercially with your own production company, did you find that the set design or the production of that differed any? Because it was public broadcasting, was it sort of a more relaxed production environment? Or was the content just a little better or a little longer because of that format difference?
I do find with commercial work that, as far as with news or news magazines, they're much more focused on what it is they want. They're shaping the story. Say NBC News would send you out to get some people who were upset over the story, and I'd go to, say, maybe the Ford Motor Company plant in Brook Park and talk to some people coming out of work and ask them what their impressions were of the fact that these soldiers had lost their life. And almost to a man, they would come out and say they support our efforts there. They knew, that their lives were endangered when they went over, and it was tragic, but that they supported the president, they supported the Congress, they supported what our soldiers were doing. So it would really be hard for me when then my cell phone would ring and a producer in New York was asking if I got good comments, and I'd say, oh, we got some great stories, some great people, that they had some things to say, and they said, well, did they say anything about why they're upset, that our troops are over there? And I said, no, actually they support the troops being over there. They're sad about the tragedy. It's a hard blow to the community, but they support what we're doing, and they're proud of our guys for being over there. And they'd say, well, we need to get comments of people that are upset about it. And I'd say, well, that's not what I'm getting. That's not everywhere we go, that people are supporting our troops. And they said, well, our story is about them, whatever. We'll get somebody else to, and it's like, whereas with the PBS interviews, if anybody had a definite idea of what ought to come out of it, it sure didn't show in the recording of it, because it took time, and the story told itself. They would ask the questions, and then you might ask a follow-up question to probe deeper, but it wasn't produced with the idea in mind of changing opinions as much as it was helping people get the information so they could form opinions.
It's interesting because I think you see, especially in the world of the media today, you see much more shaping stories.
And they don't even hide it anymore. They're in your face, and they're telling you what to think, and they're telling you what they think, and there was a time when that would be on the opinion page, of the newspaper or editorial, but it did not come through in a news story that way. It was like, if that was not objective journalism, they don't even pretend to be objective now. They're just flat out selling something. That's hard. That's hard, because the industry's not what it was when I got into it.
So much of what we see on TV nowadays is cut down. I think it's just television as a medium is so soundbite, cut down. It's like, what did they remove from the interview? And I mean, you sit down for an hour and a half, and at the end of it, I mean, an NBC or Fox, whatever, it's you're getting like 30 seconds, 2 minutes of a 90-minute interview.
It's a bumper sticker.
I mean,
if it's not just, not even a full sentence, it's sometimes just a thought, and doesn't develop any background or perspective or whatever. They don't have time to get into the nuance of the story.
like the issue, like what are the issue at hand, whether it's political or economic or geopolitical. I mean, there's a lot of information that you just don't really get on television anymore.
And that becomes the challenge for the producer, and I think in the videographer and the editors and things, is to make the story compelling enough to cut through the clutter. Because there's so much out there, and you give everybody can like record a video now on their phone, but they don't know how to edit. And I find a lot of younger people aren't taking the time to learn how to write. They're not really learning how the value of the word, whether it's printed word or whether it's spoken word. That's really what a producer director needs to be able to do. And I think that skill has been lost, and it's lost even a lot of news, because now, you know, if you just have an agenda and you're just trying to, then you're not really forming the thoughts. You're not understanding where your audience is coming from. You're not understanding their needs to know, and you're not researching your stories to even check the facts, to check, you know, to really, nobody's got the time anymore to dig for news. Television could be so much more than that. Film could be so much more than that. Let's raise the bar.
What strikes me about those comments is maybe in some of the productions you've been in before, or your impression of them is that there needs to be integrity in some ways to the stories that are put out there, where you think of a conversation, there's a dialogue, it's a dialogos, it's two people speaking. And presumably if you're airing something on television or you're trying to inform people, it should be with the truth. And you don't necessarily see that in media nowadays.
Right.
So interesting to get your perspective on that as a producer or someone who's gone out to shoot those sorts of things. So kind of getting back to what we were talking about before, you were working at Classic and then eventually at a point broke off and started your own company. I'm sure that was probably a pretty difficult decision to go out and say, I'm going to strike out and create something from scratch and then build this company and then make it profitable for you and your family. What was that decision like when you were kind of making the decision to strike out by yourself?
Actually, the move wasn't exactly planned, at least not by me. I had a client that I had been cultivating that was actually a missionary in Latin America. I had gone to South America and filmed with him and so forth. And when he came up here to do the editing at Classic, then I had to run an errand, and Jerry Patton drove to the airport to pick up my client and bring him over from the airport to the edit suite. And on the trip back, the guy proceeded to tell Jerry that he was trying to get me to come work for him. Which didn't go over so well. Jerry called me I went on vacation the next week, and when I came back, Jerry called me into his office and said, "Hey, I hear you're considering going to work for this gentleman." And I said, "Well, he's talked about it." He said, "Well, are you thinking about it?" And I said, "Yeah, I am thinking about it." He says, "Well, that's great." He said, "Because I'm in a situation where I've got to cut some staff." And I've got to reduce some budget. And I was really fretting over who I was going to get rid of. And he goes, "You just made it easier for me." And in the meantime, the opportunity for that job went away. And it was totally unprepared. I mean, it was not what I had planned. I didn't leave there on bad terms. They were always very fair with me. They were always very good with me, and I have no complaints. And I continued to, for a while, I didn't even own any video equipment at the time, so I said, no, I'll rent their equipment. You know, rent Classic's equipment when I have a project that I need it. And so I talked to them, and they said, sure. Well, that worked out good for a while, until some of my projects then, when I called to reserve the equipment, no problem. When I went to pick it up, the good equipment maybe sometimes would be out on a job for their clients, and it became kind of difficult. And I remember a turning point for me was when I rented a camera package, and there was literally the wedge plate that goes between the camera and the tripod, that the camera snaps onto the tripod. The wedge plate was missing. Somebody had taken it with another camera or something, and I literally had no way of fastening the camera to the tripod, and so I ended up having to hold the camera on my shoulder for the entire day. And I was like, I had to fake it through the production enough that the client was never unhappy with what we did, but it was like, it was backbreaking for me. And I looked at it and said, you know what, this is not working. And my wife was wise enough to say to me, she says, if you're going to be in video production business, you need to own equipment. I couldn't believe it. I didn't have to sell her on the idea. She was actually telling me if I had to own equipment. I said, wow, this is like Christmas. So I started ordering equipment, and then it's like she said, how much did all that cost? And I told her, and she goes, oh, I didn't know it was going to cost that. So since then, whenever I would buy a new piece of equipment, she always asked me, how many zeros in the price? Because she knew it was going to be $1,000? Are we talking about $10,000? Are we talking about $50,000? Like, how are we going to pay for that? And so, getting back to leaving Classic, that was our beginning. It was like hand to mouth, literally for many years, and we didn't take vacations when our children were little. I mean, we would take vacations, but we might go to Mackinac Island, or we'd do something up here closer that wouldn't have been so expensive, because that just wasn't in the cards. Money went to the banks to pay for the interest and all that. I used to joke, we have a partnership with the bank. I do all the work, they make all the money. It works really well.
Well, it seems to have worked out. I mean, you've been involved in quite a few large projects, I mean, internationally as well as domestically. I mean, you've traveled around the world and around the nation shooting in a variety of different places, presumably with equipment you've rented, borrowed, stolen, or something. But can you tell us a little bit about some of the jobs that you've been involved in when owning your own company?
It started off, I was doing freelance work, sometimes even for Classic Productions and Worldwide Productions, the company I had worked for before. They would call me when they had a project, if they needed a cameraman or if they needed a field producer or something like that. I would go do it. And sometimes Jerry would call me to be a videographer or director of photography or a field producer for projects. And one time he called me and he said, I have a project for you. It's for Access Hollywood. And it's, he told me whatever. And I said, wow, that sounds interesting. It wasn't a real big project, but it was like, it was going to be filmed here in the area. And he goes, I don't need to make anything on this one. He goes, you just go do it. And so he basically handed me the job. It was interesting because the client loved the scenes. They loved how I lit it. They loved, what we shot. And next thing I know, Access Hollywood's calling me on a regular basis and not going through him. And I talked to Jerry. I said, hey, I'm not trying to steal your client here. He goes, no. He says, you can just do it. And next thing I know, Access Hollywood's calling me all the time. And then the next thing you know, I get a call from the crew desk there. And he said, I'm not with Access anymore. I'm with Fox Sports in LA. And it was like, oh. And so he was calling, and the next thing you know, I'm now still doing work for Access Hollywood, but now I'm doing things for Fox Sports. The continuity of that, it just started to grow. And one at a time, I started picking up more and more clients on a national and international basis. For Fox Sports, I was working as a field producer for the playoffs. And then the next week, when we weren't playing Boston anymore in the playoffs, we were playing New York Yankees in the American League Championship Series, and I got a call from the desk at NBC Sports to be second unit cameraman. They brought their first cameraman in from New York, but they needed a second guy to shoot the reverse angles and to shoot some of the interviews and things like that. Well, it was going to be a one-day shoot, to shoot for the pregame show for the championship series, and one of the players didn't show up for practice that day, and they said, we're going to have to bump that to tomorrow. Well, my wife had lined up a birthday party for my daughter who was going to be 13 on that day, and I had promised to drive the van with a whole car full of 13-year-old girls, you know, to come to this party. And it was like, I looked at the director and said, yeah, I'm already booked for tomorrow. Because in that moment, I just knew next week, the guys at NBC Sports are not even going to remember my name or my phone number. But if I'm not there for my 13-year-old daughter when her birthday party was, she wasn't going to forget that Dad let her down or Dad wasn't there or whatever. She was more important to me than that job. So I actually turned down NBC Sports for American League Championship Series for day 2 of the production because I was already booked. I had another gig, my daughter.
It's an interesting comment. That's one thing I wanted to ask you. I mean, with having your own business, and let alone that business being a video production company, how did you often manage the demands of, say, a busy family life with, I mean, the incredible demands of so much work in this production company?
A lot of times, the whole family jumped in, rolled up their sleeves, and got busy and did it. Sometimes my daughters, when they got old enough, would go along on shoots and roll up cables. Or they would help drag stuff out to the van. You know, I'd pile the stuff up by the door, and then they'd start dragging it out there to the car, and we'd load it up. Sometimes, I mean, there was Jerry Lewis telethons we did up in Erie, Pennsylvania, and sometimes we'd take a box truck with lights and go up there and light the middle of Mill Creek Mall. My kids and my wife would ride along in the Ryder or U-Haul rental truck, and we'd get a room or whatever and stay over and make a little mini vacation going to Erie, PA. You know, just because you have to take the opportunities, you know, as they come along, and it could be either another weekend away that you hadn't planned on that came up at the last minute, or you can say, let's go hang out in Erie. And then maybe they go do some back to school shopping while Dad's lighting the mall, and then we go back and play by the pool or go to the beach, go out to dinner, and then Dad goes back the next day and packs up the gear and we go home, and they start school the next day.
You found the good where you could find it.
Yeah.
In some of the jobs that you had done with your production company, I know some of them were fed by Classic, maybe at the get-go, but then as the client base started to build, did you find that you received more work through word of mouth, or did you have to continually market yourself? I guess in the later years of your production company, how did you generally stay busy?
So at the time, some of the work would come back in through Classic, you know, Jerry would still keep calling me, but it was like, sometimes it was through the Ohio Film Commission. And then there are crew companies that, there's a bunch of them around that are almost like an agent that represents crews. And hard to get your foot in the door with them because you've got to provide demos of your work, and they're looking for certain things, and then you've got to have letters of reference from different clients and things that you've done, and you know. And so I got my foot in the door with a couple of these crew companies that, you know, became my agent to kind of, you know, send me some work, and all of it together became a recipe for making that thing, the business, work for an individual. And I didn't burn a bridge with Classic, which I think was good because, one, Jerry and Bob were great guys, and they're just good friends, and they always have been. But we trusted each other, and that kind of thing of, look, I wasn't going to lose that relationship and that supplier over $50, $500, $1,000, whatever it was going to be. You got to take care of the people who brought you to these parties to begin with. It's like you work with them, they work with you, and I was their supplier. Sometimes they were my supplier, you know. So it's a dance.
One other project I don't know if it's a project, but another area of expertise in your production company is a background in disaster and crisis response. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you came about that background and what kinds of things you do with that.
I can remember clearly waking up in the morning and just not wanting to get out of bed. There's probably a lot of days like that, but this particular day when I literally I wasn't happy doing what I was doing. And I remember laying in bed and just praying, God, use me to do something that really makes a difference, that makes my heart sing. About mid-morning, the phone rings. The person doesn't say hello. It's Jerry Patton on the phone. My former employer, my client. He doesn't say hello. He just says, is your passport up to date? And I said, where? And he said, North Africa. And I said, when? He said, Tuesday. And this was Thursday, mid-morning. I said, yes, yes, and yes. Didn't ask how much. Didn't ask where in North Africa. Didn't even ask who the client was. I didn't even know about that much of what the project was, but it was going into a country that was in the middle of a civil war. And we were actually right along the border between that country and the country we flew into. And I remember getting on the phone with the person who was handling the logistics for the crew and things getting into this country. And we were actually right along the border between that country and the country we flew into. We called him to get the information about the project, and he was telling us all the things we did not want to hear. My wife got on one line of the phone, and I got on the other line of the phone, and we were asking, well, this country has landmines, and they have a war going on. We're not going to be anywhere near that. He goes, well, you could be, or whatever. Everything he told us about what we were going to do on the assignment, which I didn't know very many of the details, I did not like the answers I was hearing, but what I liked was that he understood what he was getting into. He knew where we were going. And finally, my wife just says to him on the phone, this sounds really dangerous. Is he going to be all right? Is he coming back from this? And the guy said, let me put it this way. I've got a wife and 2 kids, and I expect to come back to them. If your husband doesn't come back, then I don't come back. So we decided to go. We were exposed to on this production, and I was running camera on this, and they had a field producer who was actually directing a lot of the things that we were filming and things. But I came back and I thought, I don't understand anything about what that conflict was that we were in the middle of. There was gunfire going on. There were soldiers. We were driving by United Nations troops and gunfire in the night, when we were trying to sleep and things like that. And we were surrounded by freedom fighters from that country. Through the night, there were literally these teenage kids rocking around with AR-15s, or AK-47s actually, through the night. And I'm thinking, if I ever go into a place like that again, I want to understand more of the conflict. So I started getting online for the next 2 or 3 years and just reading everything I could about Northern Africa, the Middle East, and trying to understand the conflict and things like that, and found out about an organization that actually does training for missionaries, for law enforcement people, for people going into conflict zones, areas where people face extreme persecution for their faith or for political things, for humanitarian needs and all that. It was just very, very complex scenarios, and this training helped you understand the big picture and the small picture of what was going on. Why these children are crawling around on the ground with polio when it's been eradicated in the rest of the world. Why are these children falling through the cracks? For a 25 cents worth of vaccine, it could be eradicated. And their government wouldn't allow the United Nations or medical missionaries in to even stop the fighting long enough to vaccinate these children so they don't have to live like that. And they were flying over with helicopters, bombing food lines, that were trying to feed people and things like that. And I'm thinking, what is going on in this world that's the kind of thing? And it just became such a compelling thing to me. That prayer that I had prayed, show me something that I can do to make a difference in the world. I found something that I could sink my teeth into, that I could look at and say, this makes a difference. That entertainment show or that news magazine or whatever, that fluff piece or that corporate video, where we're marketing or hawking this product or that or whatever. It's like, those are all fine and they paid the bills and there was honor in that and, doing it well. It just, for me, then going and taking the training on how to work in disaster areas in crisis zones and things like that was very compelling. And we began, after taking the training, I took it twice, and after the second time they asked me to help start teaching some of the training to people, to actually teach them how to do videography in war zones, disaster areas, and places where people face persecution and death every day. Because there's unique things you need to know about what equipment to take, what not to take, how to be lean, mean, and fast, how to go portable, how to tell stories. And I think we became pretty good at doing it. I had an opportunity to go to a lot of different countries and some fascinating places, doors that I never would have dreamt I could have gone through, but maybe with a camera to begin with. And then it got to a point where in time, I was going just for the humanitarian work and didn't even care if I ever took a camera or not. I didn't even, in fact, sometimes the camera just got in the way because I was watching people dying and going, yeah, well, I got some great footage. But frankly, the farthest distance that footage had to go was not from Northern Africa or the Middle East or Asia or Hong Kong or wherever it might be, back to here. It was once it got cut together and got in front of people's faces, that distance from here and here to here, it might not make it. Something has to really touch people right where they're at in order for it to cut through all that, the garbage messages that are out there, to really ring true and say, this is worth watching and worth listening to, and stop everything else, focus everything else out, and just, wow. If it's not that compelling, then I've failed.
Do you think that's really the power of video, really, as a medium to help change situations in the world? Is that ability to show and to tell at the same time?
If it's not, then we're wasting our time. We're wasting a lot of resources. That very first project that I did, that I worked on, where we went into that African country, the client who actually picked up the tab for that one was able to use that footage and raise funds. I think they spent a couple $100,000 to do it, but they raised millions of dollars in relief efforts that actually directly helped save lives and made a difference for the people there, to the point where the people in that country said, let the Americans come back, let the Christians come back, because they make a difference. It made a difference for us. It saved our lives, it saved our children. And this one, after the tsunami, I mean, literally some of the people that we had an opportunity to meet, you know, even local imams and the mayors in the towns and things like that would say, please come back. And when you do, bring your children so we can love them like you loved ours. And it's like, that was what it was about. It wasn't going over there to proselytize. It wasn't going over there to change their minds. It was going over there just to meet their needs, to look them in the eye and be able to say, we care about what's happening to you. And it does matter. You matter. And just by demonstrating that our values were something that they could trust, that we had character, and that we cared about them, that we loved them, even though we didn't know them before that. That to me, I mean, the power of television, the power of the medium. It's a tool. It's not that the power is in it. The power is in what we do with it. And if we're doing it, I think, for a higher purpose, for allowing people to come face to face with something bigger than themselves, it's worth taking a risk financially. It's worth taking a risk with your life, your health. Because when it's all said and done, those are the things that last. Regardless of how I live, I'm only got so much time, and when I'm gone, what difference did I make?
I can tell you're very passionate about especially diving into some of the stories that you want to tell, and I think the disaster relief and some of those other things. You know, we get into video to tell stories. You've obviously been producing for a long time and shooting in a variety of different areas. and producing different projects, both passion projects
right.
and those you've been hired for, which are still, as you said, interesting and noble. But I'm wondering, for those who would be getting into this industry sort of in the future or in the years ahead, can you think of any salient points of advice that you would give to someone who's trying to break into this field?
On the area of the disaster relief things, I would say I would really encourage a person to get training, to really understand, because there's so much complexity to those things. And until you know what you're getting into, you can get yourself killed. And also, if you don't tell the story well, you can get people killed. Because sometimes you don't even know what the political ramifications of an answer they may give you are. And so the last thing in the world you want to do when you're going over there to help people is cause them more grief, or to cause them to become victims of the fact that you were there. I wanted to be able to put my head on a pillow at night and know that I didn't go in there because I cared about their politics. I went in there because I cared about the people. And I cared just as much about the people on one side of the conflict as I do the other, because they're all hurting people and they're all desperate. And in the end, we all put our pants on, or our sarong, or whatever it may be, our sandals. But at the end of the day, we're flesh and blood. We're human. I want to leave the place better than I found it when I came in. I want people to come away from it going, wow, it's a better world because she was there.
It's a powerful lesson. Thinking though of your experience in starting a business here in the US, aside from disaster relief and some of those other things you've done, are there any maybe two pieces of advice that you would give to either a young person or an old person who's thinking about starting their own production company?
It started off probably thinking that it was an art, that we were making art, and I think along the way I became aware that it was a business. And after a period of time, then things evolved to where hopefully I can get back to where I can go back to making art and making things that are aesthetically strong, and making not just all the decisions based on bottom line and whether it's profitable or not, to get that balance right. So I think a lot of it is balancing the art with the business. And I would encourage young people to always be learning, and not just going on the internet and looking at YouTube videos, although you can learn a lot of things but I think through relationships, everybody that you meet, whether it's a window washer or whether it's another videographer or another lighting person, there are things you can learn from them. If somebody's good at what they do, then people notice, people enjoy being around it, they enjoy learning from them. And I want to be able to both, I guess, have that enthusiasm and show the excellence in the work that I do, but also that I don't miss what other people have to offer me. And so there have been people along the way who I probably thought at the time may have thought I had nothing at all I could gain by being nice to that person. Well, if you take the time to like get to know them and maybe even learn something from them, they remember that. And years later, when you walk in the door of your new client and find out that they're now the director of marketing and they're your client, and they go, wow, I remember when you blah, 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 whatever. And they have a context to put it in to where it's a relationship thing. And so much of it is relationship along the way. We cross paths. And do we miss those opportunities, or do we really embrace them and humble ourselves enough to say, I'm still learning? Because the technology is changing, business models change, production techniques, there's always a better way to do it. There's always more interesting, compelling things. Or do I hoard what I know, or am I allowing them the opportunity to benefit from something that I learned the hard way? If I can avoid them having to hit their head against the wall 3 times and maybe only do it once, then they're going to be happier. And if somebody had have done that with me along the way, it might have been easier for me.
So much of, I think, this business, or our business, what we're involved in, is about relationships. And if you're trying to tell a story, if you're really not connecting with people, whether it's on the street, outside of your business context, you're not going to do it when you're working. The heart's
take care of the relationships. And even some of those early clients, like I mentioned earlier, you know, they might be working for one client when you met them, and then they go somewhere else, and if they leave a file on the work that you did that says he did a good job for us, and they go somewhere else, and then they call you from there, now you've got two clients. And it's all about relationship. So take care of them. Take care of the relationships.
This has been a great conversation, Ron. If people want to find out more about you, your company, and your work, where should they go to get in touch with you?
I guess online, you know, you could Google search the name, Ron Day, or my website. It's really hard to remember, ronday.com. Email ron@ronday.com.
Ron, this has been a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time.